Hello and welcome to the 8th season of the Maritime Impact Podcast. I'm your host Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV. We'll start off this season by discussing the outcomes of MEPC 82, specifically where the IMO's work on reductions of greenhouse gas emissions from ships is heading. I will not be covering the non-GHG matters this time around, so listeners who are interested in that can head over to our web pages and find a technical regulatory newsletter addressing the full MEPC 82 outcome. In following episodes we will, yet again, take a look at what's happening with the incoming EU legislation, in particular the Fuel EU Maritime, which kicks in from January 1st, 2025, which of course is less than 3 months down the road. But for now, we're heading back to London's Albert Embankment and the outcomes of the latest MEPC meeting. We hope you enjoy the episode. Now on to the show. To set the stage, I want to start off with a brief recap to remind us all of where we stand with the ongoing IMO greenhouse gas work. As I trust everyone remembers, MEPC 80, all the way back in 2023, saw agreement on a revised strategy, which in simple terms is one where the IMO agreed that shipping should fully decarbonize by 2050. Intermediate goals were established for 2030 and 2040, 20% and 70% respectively, along with a target for 2030 of a minimum 5% uptake of zero or near zero greenhouse gas technologies and fuels. And some language fuzziness notwithstanding, these remain the target dates we're working towards. Another fundamental adjustment to the strategy at that time was a decision to have the reduction targets address not only what happens when the fuel is used on board the ship, but also to take into account emissions associated with the production of that fuel. In other words, the strategy targets are now on a well-to-wake basis. The strategy was hard-fought and no doubt a significant achievement, but at MEPC we're now working towards something that is even more challenging. And that is developing the package of clear and enforceable regulations necessary for the strategic goals to be reached. We have an agreement from MEPC 80 that these regulations are to enter into force in 2027, and the work got underway at MEPC 81 earlier this year. You may recall that I previously described that meeting as a highly technical one and driven by intense political positioning, with an outcome that was not a grand compromise, but rather an incremental step forward. And in many ways, MEPC 82 and its outcome can be described the same way. So what exactly is IMO trying to develop? MEPC 80 agreed on a so-called basket of measures comprising two key elements. One is a technical measure aiming to regulate the greenhouse gas intensity of fuels used on board ships, the so-called GFI. The other is an economic measure imposing some form of carbon pricing. The agreed plan is for these measures to become clear MARPOL regulations, ready to be approved at MEPC 83 in April 2025, and then adopted at an extraordinary session of the MEPC in October 2025. That will allow them to enter into force in 2027, most likely becoming effective from January 2028. MEPC 82 was building on the outcome from previous meetings, where we did manage to agree on the so-called net zero framework for greenhouse gas reductions from shipping. This was in essence a common structure for the future regulations, but without very detailed content. The goal, and one of the outcomes for MEPC 82, was to attempt to shoehorn all the various proposals into this common framework and to start narrowing down some options. But there were no expectations for a grand political compromise this time around. So what's now included in this framework? On the technical side, the framework remains dominated by the two key options we had at MEPC 81, but with some additional elements also lifted in from other proposals. One is fronted by the EU and directly applies the well-to-wake approach to calculate greenhouse gas intensity. The other is spearheaded by China and applies a tank-to-wake approach to the calculation, taking well-to-tank performance into account in the form of weighting factors being applied to the tank-to-wake figures. Both proposals are designed to meet the well-to-wake greenhouse gas intensity targets of the IMO greenhouse gas strategy, but there are political reasons for the different approaches. This is therefore one of the challenging red lines in the negotiations. Another important part of the GFI design is a consideration of allowing flexibility when it comes to compliance. As you may recall, under the Fuel EU Maritime, which conceptually is where the EU, for instance, is coming from here, There are features such as banking, borrowing, and pooling intended to ease the path to compliance. Similar options are being proposed for the GFI by both the EU and by China et al. While the proposals are not identical, this is yet another area where MEPC 82 showed a distinct possibility of finding common ground. But this is where another red line appears. A grouping of numerous Pacific and Caribbean islands are digging in their heels and refusing to accept any compliance provisions. The thinking appears to be that if flexibility is accepted, these regions will be left behind when it comes to the availability of alternative fuels. So that's two red lines right there. Easing our way into the economic part of the discussions, you should be aware that we are discussing at least two different sets of economic mechanisms in the regulations. Seen from a high level, the crucial distinction is that one of them is part of the GFI mechanism, where there are various proposed options for payments to a fund mechanism. Fees, surcharges, trading, there are many variations being bandied about, but the essence is that payments are being imposed in those cases where non-compliance occurs. The other option on the table is a carbon price on actual total emissions. This is also known by different names such as levy or contribution, and is proposed at varying price levels as high as $150 per ton CO2. And there is an important aspect where the proposers take differing views. Those behind the EU proposals are of the view that a fixed bunker levy needs to be added to the basket of measures, while several of the supporters behind what China is fronting believe that building an integrated economic instrument is enough. During MEPC 82, we did see greater understanding and at least some convergence on the technical GFI regulation. On the economic element, the situation remains much more challenging. This brings us directly to maybe the most difficult part of MEPC 82, carbon pricing as part of the economic measure. The IMO member states remain deeply divided on the issue of universal levy being applied to shipping, and positions have not shifted much over the last meetings. In addition to the aspect just discussed, whether the element embedded in the technical GFI proposal is sufficient or needs to be supplemented by a levy, there are additional positions and red lines worth noting. We have the Pacific and Caribbean islands, supported by some other countries, continuing to make it very clear that their central and non-negotiable regulatory goal is a levy, starting at $150 per ton CO2 as previously mentioned. And that would equate to an add-on of roughly $450 per ton on the price of conventional fuels. Then we have the EU, with some additional supporters viewing the GFI as a primary emission reduction mechanism, but taking the view that a levy is essential to enhance early uptake of alternative fuels. They mostly see the levy as a revenue-generating mechanism, but one that also would then contribute towards levelizing the difference between alternative and conventional fuels. Both these groups see the funds as being used for enhancing shipping decarbonization efforts in various ways, and not least ensuring that equity is handled in a meaningful fashion. Broadly speaking, they are also open to a fee-based mechanism where some revenue goes to incentivize early movers. But then it should also be noted that one Pacific country explicitly called for money to go to other non-IMO related funds to deal with climate reparations, or loss or damages as it is known under the UNFCCC process. The third group, consisting of many of the supporters of the proposal China is spearheading, along with several others, is deeply and vocally opposed to funds being collected through a levy. There are diverse reasons for this, but one core argument being made is that a levy is a tax on trade, and this will penalize developing nations more than developed ones, and is therefore utterly unacceptable. And this is where a bit of understanding of how the MEPC works comes in handy. If we were only counting voices and votes, we would see that levy proponents outnumber opponents almost 2-1, and in a straight-up vote, the decision would be made handily. But MEPC almost never votes. It operates by consensus. And in this case, those opposing the levy include many very significant countries, meaning that a decision cannot be made without them also being brought on board. So this is maybe the reddest of the red lines to be resolved, and it is of course where the clever diplomacy needs to come into play. We're looking towards extensive behind-the-scenes diplomacy, as well as 2 intersessional meetings before MEPC 83 to hopefully come up with a grand compromise. But there is a very real risk that it will all come down to the wire and the end of MEPC 83 before we have something ready to be approved. Still, I remain an optimist and expect the member states to hammer out an agreement for approval at MEPC 83 and then adopt it in October 2025. One final point to make on greenhouse gases. I've been talking almost exclusively about the next-gen incoming regulations, but MEPC 82 also did work on the existing short-term greenhouse gas regulations. In keeping with the agreed work plan, MEPC 82 started the scheduled review of the Carbon Intensity Indicator, the CII, and the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, the SEMP. The review is to formally conclude by the end of 2025. But as anyone working with the CII knows, it has a significant number of issues that need to be resolved. Due to combination of timing issues and better data not becoming available until 2027, MEPC 82 agreed to split the review into two phases, one to conclude by end 2025 and one to take place 2026 onwards. A correspondence group will work on the split, and this is to be further discussed and concluded at MEPC 83. A key problematic issue here is that despite enforcement being soft at present and bad ratings not leading to legal problems, the fact of the matter is that the CII is also used for commercial purposes, and this means that there are commercial costs associated with the present deficiencies. So those of you who were hoping for action this time around will be disappointed, I'm sorry to say. We can only hope that MEPC 83 will be able to resolve the most pressing issues. To the key takeaways. MEPC 82 was yet another meeting dominated by greenhouse gas discussions. Work continues on the regulations that are to be agreed in response to the strategy. The discussions were highly technical, but also driven by intense political positioning, also this time around. We did see some convergence on the technical discussions of the greenhouse gas fuel intensity regulation, but little real movement on the economic measure, including on the levy positions. But we now have a common negotiating platform in a fleshed-out net zero framework, and there was a clear desire to work towards maintaining the agreed timeline of approval at MEPC 83 in April 2025. So while we have quite the challenge ahead of us, I remain cautiously optimistic that the MEPC will be able to land this plane on schedule. You've been listening to the Maritime Impact podcast from DNV with me, Eirik Nyhus. This was a summary of the greenhouse gas discussions at MEPC 82, and needless to say, we'll be following any developments as we head towards MEPC 83 next spring. Later this season, we'll focus on the latest updates and critical actions required for fuel EU maritime compliance, along with its commercial implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give us a rating or review. Thank you for listening.